This morning, I've been really convicted, not just in my own life, but even just wrestling with the life of the church. Deeply convicted in my heart by this question: are we using God's community for our benefit, or are we serving the kingdom of God, God's community, for their benefit? Like, are we functioning as a parasite off of the kingdom of God? Or are we sacrificing ourselves for the kingdom? Because here's one of the things I've noticed in my own heart and in the heart of the church. It's really easy. It's actually conveniently troubling how simple it is for us to use the people of God to benefit ourselves instead of doing what Christ did for us, and that is laying down his very life for us. Let me explain what I mean by this. I am not suggesting that it is inappropriate for you to gain anything from the kingdom, but you have to understand, a community centered on Christ is a reciprocal relationship where you give and you receive. So receiving is not the issue. The question is that what you expect? Do you come with the disposition towards the people of God or towards the church or for Sunday mornings with the focus on receiving something? Or are you there to give all that you are? It reminds me of one of my criticisms I've had in the past of worship services, and it's specifically this. My critique of worship services is the people that critique the worship service. People that are like, oh, the music's too loud. Oh, I don't like the lights. Oh, I wish they played more old hymns. Oh, I wish, the sound wasn't. All kinds of different types of complaints, as if the worship service was set up to serve you. As if the sermon was present to tickle your itching ear. As if a worship service could be critiqued by the person that the worship service was never even geared towards. Now, if God critiques our worship service, that's different. But when people in the pews are critiquing the worship service, I start to do a pause, a self-reflection, and ask myself this question. Are we using God's community for our benefit? Or are we serving God's community for their benefit? Reciprocal relationships necessitate both components, but especially that second component of serving. Where did all this come from? It came from reflecting on Nehemiah chapter 5. Let me put the setting in place. The northern kingdom went into exile around 722 BCE or BC. The southern kingdom then goes into exile, you're talking around 605, and eventually a little bit later down around the late 580s. Now we're in around middle of the 5th century, so middle of the 400s. And they've just received a decree not too long ago that allowed the Jews who were exiled north-south to come back home. And when they got back home, the people of God began using the people of God the same way that the kings and the tyrants of Babylon were using God's people, oppressing God's people. Chapter 5, verse 1, book of Nehemiah. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. The exiles that have returned, raised an outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, we and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. Still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery, selling their children to pay the taxes. The famine is destroying them. And if your sole income is based off of the fields, it's based off of the fruit that you are able to produce from the ground, then what do you do whenever the famine is destroying your crop? It says some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. They then had to mortgage their fields. They then had to even sell their children. And this is to other Jews. It's not to Babylon. It's not to Persia. It's not to the Assyrians. It's the people of God taking advantage of the people of God. Verse 6, when Nehemiah says, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was ticked. I was very angry. Verse 7, I pondered them in my mind, and then I went straight to the nobles and the officials, and I accused them. I told them, you are charging your own people interest. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us? They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So Nehemiah continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let us stop charging interest. If you have it to give the people in need, give it to them. But don't parasite, don't siphon their life off of them. Don't take advantage and benefit from the people of God in their time of need. Verse 11, give back to them immediately their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses, and also the interest you're charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. My question for me and for us this week is this. Are we using God's community, God's kingdom for our benefit, or are we serving God's kingdom for the benefit of others? When you engage church, are you there for you? Or are you there to serve another? Are you listening to a sermon, expecting some sort of benefit to you? Do you treat the ministers at the church that you tithe to as your employees, threatening to stop tithing? Or are you there to serve others? One of the things that Jesus says in John 17 is that the world will know who we are by the way we treat one another. And my hunch is this. Our evangelism to this lost, broken world, this world struggling with depression and oppression, with tyrants and all kinds of evil, will come to a saving knowledge of Jesus when the church starts treating others in the church the way that Christ treated us. My challenge for you this week is to ask yourself this penetrating question. Am I using God's kingdom for my benefit, or am I serving God's kingdom for the benefit of others? And you just might find that the more you press into serving God's kingdom for the benefit of others, you might receive a little something yourself. I love you guys. Have a good week.